how did you get in here?" "I walked in," said Mrs. Frisby, keeping her voice calm with an effort. "I found a branch with thorns, smoothed it off. I pushed it back and found." "I know," said the rat rather rudely. "And now walk out again. You aren't allowed in here." He moved a few inches toward her, placing himself between her and the entrance. She noticed how powerful his muscles looked under his glossy coat. He would almost be a match for a dragon, almost, but not quite. "Go on," he repeated, "but I have a reason. I don't care what you have. Go away. You're small. I wouldn't want you to get hurt. I wouldn't want to hurt you. Are you Justin?" Mrs. Frisby inched back as the rat inched forward. "I'm Brutus. Justin's not here." That was reasonably obvious. Mrs. Frisby thought that the rat named Brutus added, "You know Justin?" "No," said Mrs. Frisby. That is not exactly. If you don't know him, how do you know his name?" Brutus sounded puzzled, and Mrs. Frisby observed that although he was greatly oversized and muscular, his eyes were bright enough. He looked very young. It was told to me by a friend. "Can I see him?" "Justin? No, he's at a meeting. I'm taking his place." "They're all at a meeting, but me." "Bad luck," thought Mrs. Frisby. "He's a substitute," she said. "Then I'll wait for him." "No," said Brutus, "you can't stay here. I've got orders. Now go, or I'll have to take you out myself." He moved forward again. "My name," said the mouse desperately, "is Mrs. Jonathan Frisby. I went to see Nicodemus." It did not work. "I don't care what your name is, and you can't see Nicodemus, that's sure." Brutus now looked both puzzled and annoyed. "Move on, and be quick." "All right," said Mrs. Frisby. You needn't force me." I'll go." She turned slowly and walked back away, the way that she had come from. She felt like crying after coming all this way, after flying to see the owl, to be turned back so abruptly at the end. She thought as she walked into the darker part of the bush, maybe she could just wait for an hour or so until the meeting was over, then go back, and perhaps the rat named Justin would be at the entrance. But would Justin pay any more attention to her than Brutus had done? She had a feeling that he would. But when she stopped, she heard footsteps behind her. She looked back and saw Brutus was following her. So she stared again, hurrying to keep out of his sight. After a while, she paused again and listened. This time there was no sound. He must have gone back to his post. She sat down on the ground. Then ahead of her, in the little direction of the place where she had entered the bush, she heard a rustle, a faint scraping noise. It was the branch she had pushed to get in. Someone else was moving it. Someone was coming in, walking along the narrow path toward her. It must be another rat. Suddenly she was terrified. What would he do, meeting her unexpectedly in this dimness? She shrank to one side as close she could to get on the wall of thorns, hoping that whoever it might go on past not seeing her. Then he came around the curve and she saw him. It was moving extremely slowly and realized that he was limping badly. One of his legs was injured. It was wrapped in splints and bandaged. Mr. Aegis called softly, "It's Mrs. Frisby." "Who?" He peered into the shadow. "I can't see you." "Mrs. Frisby." She moved into the middle of the path in front of him. "Why, Why, so it is, Mrs. Frisby. How do you do?" He sounded cordial enough, but he was startled. I didn't know that. How do you happen to be in here?" "It's a long story." "Then tell me while I rest. I'm supposed to be at a meeting, but I'm late already, and a few minutes more won't matter. As you can see, I had a bad fall and broke my ankle." "I'm sorry to hear that. I hope it doesn't hurt." "It is mending, but I can walk only slowly and need to rest frequently." He sat down with a sigh. "Now tell me, what are you doing in the rat's bush?" Mrs. Frisby told him as briefly as she could about Timothy, Jeremy, the owl, and Brutus. Mr. Aegis listened in a silent, interrupting only once. "You went into the owl's tree?" "Yes, but I was afraid." "I should think so. That took courage." I had to do it." When she had finished her story, Mr. Aegis sat quietly for a minute, considering it. "Poor Timothy," he said. "At last, I should have thought of that myself. But of course, when I gave you the medicine, the weather had not turned warm. Then I fell and broke my leg, and I forgot all about it." He stood up. "I think," he said, "that you should come with me back to the entrance." "But I can't. Brutus will still be there." Mrs. Frisby, having done all that you have done, you are not going to give up now. I'll talk to Brutus." "You know him?" "I've known him since he was born." "He's not very old, you know. I think he will do what I ask." From the way he said this, Mrs. Frisby could tell he did not merely think it. He knew it. "But how?" "All right," she said doubtfully. "I'll try again, but I don't understand. How do you know Brutus?" We had better move along." They started back toward the entrance at Mr. Aegis' slow limping pace. As to how I know Brutus, that's a much longer story than yours, and I doubt that I'm the one to tell it to you. It is for Nicodemus to say. But I will tell you this: if we go in the entrance, as we will, if you are to ask for help, you must promise that you will never tell anyone anything at all about what you see or hear." "I promise," said Mrs. Frisby. Again she thought she had no choice. "The owl told me that too." When they approached the entrance again, Mrs. Frisby saw that Brutus stood at his post as before, but that another rat joined him. Two of them, she thought. "I hope Mr. Aegis knows them both." The new rat saw them coming. He looked alert, dark gray and a color of extraordinary handsome, though he not so huge as Brutus. "Mr. Aegis," he said, "how's the leg?" "Better, but it will be a while before I can run again." "Justin," said Brutus, staring at Mrs. Frisby. "There she is. That's the one I'm telling you about." "Is she now?" Justin looked at her casually. He did not sound particularly alarmed. "Mrs. Frisby," said Mr. Aegis formally, "may I present my friends Justin and Brutus?" "How do you do?" Brutus sounded doubtful. Mrs. Frisby said, "Justin, not Mrs. Jonathan Frisby." "She is Mrs. Jonathan Frisby," said Mr. Ages. A widow, as you know. Madam, said Justin, bowing politely as an honor to meet you. Brutus now looked astonished. You both know her? Who is she? Brutus said Mr. Ages gently. Don't you remember Mr. Jonathan? Brutus wrinkled his brow. Mr. Jonathan, you mean? The one that dragon? Yes, said Justin quickly. And this is Mrs. Jonathan. Oh, said Brutus. Then to Mrs. Frisby, why didn't you tell me? I wouldn't have chased you off. Well, said Mrs. Frisby, I did try, but it doesn't matter. No, Mr. Ages added, because on the way out she met me coming in. She needs to talk to Nicodemus, and quickly. Brutus looked doubtful again. Nicodemus, but what can she? I mean, how about the rules? What about the plan? Mr. Ages said that has been taken care of. She has promised secrecy and is to be trusted completely. That I myself guarantee. After all, consider who she is. As an afterthought, he added, and who her children are. Who am I, then? Mrs. Frisby asked herself in a wonder. I suppose that, too, will have to come from Nicodemus. Mr. Ages said to Justin, what about the meeting? It can't be over already. It was temporarily adjourned, said Justin, to wait for you. In fact, I came to find you. Then I suppose we had better go in. Justin led the way through the arched entrance to Mrs. Frisby and Mr. Ages. Brutus remained outside at his post.